Hi, Alfred. Can you hear me? It's raining this side, and I just want to be sure you can hear me.
Yes, I can hear you, Margaret.
Okay.
Good morning, afternoon, and evening to you all from wherever you are listening to us from, joining the call. I want to personally, on behalf of the organizers and partners, welcome you on this event. You're welcome to the 2022 ECOSOC Youth Forum, themed launching of the Africa Youth Partnership to advocate an equitable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. I am Alfred Ajaben, an African young leader and a Mandela Washington Fellow. I'll be your moderator for this event. To start with, we would invite Margaret Mowa, the Program Officer of Ford Foundation's Office in Eastern Africa, to give us the opening remarks. You're welcome, Madam.
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you, everyone, for joining this call this afternoon. It's really a privilege for me to represent my colleague, Dabasaki, from the Western Africa Office, Ford Foundation West Africa Office, who was not able to be here. And I just want to also thank the organizers of this forum. And I just hope that today we are going to have an opportunity to learn and to be able to share some of the experiences we have regarding youth partnership and youth leadership in Africa, specifically when we are looking at this time when we are moving towards the post-COVID-19 pandemic. Now, just before I say anything, I would like to briefly tell you about the Ford Foundation's work. Ford Foundation is a private foundation that supports visionary leaders and organizations that advance justice, fairness, and human dignity around the world. The foundation has been in existence for the last 82 years. And throughout the 82 years, it has been supporting courageous people on the front line of social change. And we work in 10 regions in the world. However, in Africa, we have 4 offices. We have the Eastern Africa office, where I am a program officer. We have the Western Africa office. My colleague Dabasaki, we've been working together with YOTA, ICRW, and Restless Development regarding this project. He was not able to join us because he's on leave. And then we also have our colleagues from the Southern Africa. They're based in Joburg. The Eastern Africa office is based in Nairobi, and the Western Africa is based in Lagos. And then we also have North Africa. North Africa covers Middle East and North Africa. So those are the 4 offices that we operate in Africa. Now, what we do really is, as I mentioned, is address inequality. And it is at the center of everything we do. And for us to address inequality, we are really guided by a mission statement, which seeks to strengthen democratic principles reduce poverty and injustice, and then promote international cooperation and advance human achievement. Now, how do we do this? We do this through funding. And our funding streams are in 3 different ways. That is, we fund individuals who are at the forefront of change. We also fund innovative ideas. And the innovative ideas can come through individuals. And then the third area where we fund institutions. And these institutions that we fund, they need to promote rule of law, to hold governments accountable for their actions. And then we also foster full participation of people in decisions that affect their lives. And looking at how do they seek equity, justice, specifically for the marginalized groups. And I think we have remained consistent on that for the last 82 years that I have spoken. Now, together with our partners, and in this time, for this specific convening, like YOTA, Restless Development, and ICRW, we really seek to focus on structures and practices and the beliefs that perpetuate inequality. And that inequality can come in many forms. It can come in economic, political, cultural, and social inequality. And that is why one of the things that we have been able to do is once the COVID-19 set in, as a foundation, we started looking at how do we support this, how do we support our constituents? And in this case, specifically for Africa, we were looking at young people in the recovery. Now, just before I just tell you about this project, one, the foundation made very deliberate choices to give grants that were going to support, or rather were supporting COVID-19, COVID recovery. And one of the funding, we actually gave it to Young Feminists Organizing, but we are still in the process of carrying out mapping. And then the other one was towards an inclusive economic recovery. And this is really was to be led by the Global South towards the international. This is also ongoing. And then the third one was also on youth inclusion in COVID-19 economic recovery plans, what we are going to discuss this evening. And then we also have another one covering the vaccine equity. Now, our aim for this as a foundation was actually to support, or rather influence, the nature and scope of post-COVID-19 economic recovery measures in the Global South. We know that many countries, if not all, were really hit badly by COVID. And again, we know Africa is young, and the majority of those who were hit by COVID-19 were young people. And again, we also wanted to support in advancing positive narratives for economic development. And finally, support alternative, credible, and concrete policy innovation, specifically led by people from the global South. Now, for us then, to be able to have done that, we needed to understand the structures, we needed to understand what was in existence. So we sort of started by building our understanding of the existing initiatives. And as a foundation, we commissioned research that was led by ICRW on youth inclusion in COVID-19 economic recovery plans. And the mapping really was to do an analysis of national and regional processes, specifically sub-Saharan Africa. And we then, after the results were out, and I'm glad that ICRW, represented by Chima, will be also sharing. So I will not say much about the mapping. He'll be able to tell you the findings of that mapping so that we may be able to understand broadly what that means. And then we had also, after the findings, we were looking at now the post-research. What do we do with the findings of the research? And we spoke to many youth-led organizations in Africa. And we were looking at organizations that would really bring in many countries, not just West. We were looking at West, East, and Southern Africa. And again, organizations that have networks within countries where they don't also work. And that's how we ended up settling at YOTA and Restless Development. YOTA and Restless Development. And we think these organizations have really have done some great work in youth development or youth-led development. Now, I will not go much into what YOTA and Restless Development are going to do today. They will be able to tell you. I will also not go into details of the findings. And then we'll also get the overview of Africa Youth Partnership that is intended to advocate for equitable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I think from there, we will be looking forward to hearing from you. And we want to encourage as many people as possible to share your experiences, to ask questions, to challenge YOTA and Restless, to also challenge ICLW, because our aim really is to learn. And then we will also have YOTA and Restless launching the project, and then also an opportunity for call for action. So in many words, I want to again thank you for finding time to join this convening, and I'm hoping we are going to learn as much as possible. So back to you, Alfred.
Thank you very much, Margaret Noah, for this insightful presentation. You again reminded us that there are key organizations that promote the cause of youth development in Africa, and YOTA and Restless Development are there leading the way. And we also thank you very much for joining the effort to partner Africa to advocate for an equitable recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. The next on our agenda is to invite Chimaraki Izembara, the Director, International Center for Research on Women, Africa, to give us his presentation. Hello, Chen. Are you there, please?
Yeah, do you hear me?
Thank you, Dr. Chima.
Hi, do you hear me? I am having difficulties connecting with everybody, but I'm quite very pleased to be here, Alfred. And thanks very much, Margaret, for that wonderful introduction. I'm struggling to put up my my slide. I'm not sure what is happening. So I'm not really sure how to proceed, because I think it would be good to put on the presentation so that people can also, as I speak, get a flavor of what we are trying to discuss here today. So I don't know if I have to pause and send it to you, Alfred, so that you give me.
Yes, please. Could you please send it to Emmanuel, and so the technical team can help you project it.
Okay, I'm sorry. That's
yeah. Whilst we wait for Dr. Chima to get his presentation together, the technical team is assisting him. We thank you all for joining this very important side event. We await on you to put together your questions, your feedback, your comments, and there will be a discussion forum where we'll give the opportunity for you to share your ideas. It's an important conversation, and I'm glad that all of you are here to be part of it. Thank you very much for coming.
I have, thanks again. I have sent that to Emmanuel, and I hope Emmanuel is able to put it up. But let me just begin by going back to the work we did, supported by the Ford Foundation. As Margaret mentioned, this work was, in our own assessment, very important in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. The work focused on youth inclusion in COVID recovery activities and policies and interventions and programs in sub-Saharan Africa. A lot happened when the pandemic happened on all of us. Not many governments were prepared for it. And there were just lots of confusion along the line in terms of how governments should respond. I think the first arm of response that we saw globally was in terms of health, related responses, letting people stay at home, stopping movements, lockdowns, and all that. And the goals of all these activities, we remember, was to prevent and address, infections, and prevent the pandemic from moving rapidly in different populations. But I think with time, in a very short time, we all realized that there was more to the pandemic than just health. There were economic issues, there were political issues, there were, just many social issues, educational issues that the pandemic provoked. And it was in that context, and it also affected different groups, different genders in different ways. And it was in the context of that, those issues, that the Ford Foundation decided to ask a number of questions around the pandemic. And our work sought to understand how COVID recovery plans unfolded in Africa, and the extent to which youth were actually a target in the unfolding economic recovery plans that we saw in different countries. It wasn't just a question of how recovery plans, we are incorporating the voices of young people, but also a question of how these plans, also thought about the interests, the well-being, the welfare of young people. And that is the discussion that we're going to have today. So Emmanuel, I think it would be great if you put this on a slide format. I think that would be much better. So just I think again, following up on the background that Margaret and Alfred had begun to speak to. We know that Africa has a population that is predominantly young. As we speak, about 65% of Africa's population is actually below age 35. That's a massive, massive number in terms of, economic issues, in terms of political issues, in terms of, quite a number of things, educational needs and all that. So that is where we are in terms of the structure and the demography of Africa's population. And then by just 8 years from now, by 2030, we know that 42% of the world's young people will actually be in Africa. That's almost 50%. 42% is almost like half of the world's young people will be in Africa. That has a major implication for the continent that we all want to see. And so if you were to take that in terms of raw numbers, it means that 375 million young people will be of working age population on the continent. That's a major thing. In a continent that is struggling with finding decent employment for young people, dignified employment for young people, and all the issues that we had in terms of delivering access to quality education, delivering access to quality healthcare in that country. So these are some of the questions, some of the background issues that we are taking into consideration by Ford Foundation in trying to launch this study. I mean, if you also look at recent literature that is emerging on COVID-19, I mean, there is a general agreement, and there is a major reason behind that. There's a disagreement that the pandemic's most damaging and enduring legacies will actually be among young people. No matter how we look at it, that is something that, and I'm going to discuss why that is the case as we move very forward. So those are some of the issues that informed this study that we tried to do. I'm not sure that the slide is up there. I don't know what is happening, but I hope that it comes up for people to see. So in terms of the objectives of our study, which will be, I think, slide 7, we wanted to analyze, I think that would be slide 7. We wanted to select, analyze national economic recovery efforts and their long-term implications in different countries. So of course, governments were implementing a lot of, policies and programs, some of them termed as national recovery efforts in the context of the pandemic. And we wanted to understand what their implications would be, particularly for young people. So we also, as part of the objective of this study, did a rapid literature review of some of those economic recovery efforts that were led by different actors in the region, some of them by Pan-African institutions like the African Development Bank, some of them led by country, led by different countries, also some of them led by bilateral organizations and funders in different sectors. I think the core and the heart of our work actually was to understand the extent and the character of youth inclusion and youth inclusion in these recovery efforts that were happening across Africa. I think a major related question to that was whether actually youth were being included and whether some of these recovery efforts targeted young people or had in mind young people as they were being rolled out in different countries. So we can move on to the next slide. So this study that we conducted had different, we approached it in different ways. I think the first approach to it was to look at what was already existing in the literature and to find out just look at documents, existing studies, policy announcements that different countries on the continent we are making in terms of recovery in the context of the pandemic, and to what extent those documents actually mentioned young people, had a focus on young people, targeted young people in some of the policies and the programs that were being implemented. And that is what this slide tries to offer us here. We looked at over 3,000 different titles, in the literature across the continent, and what we and then ultimately, some of them were not very relevant, of course. At the end of the day, we reviewed in depth almost 500 of them. At the end of the day, we found that almost 150 of those documents, met the criteria that we are looking for in terms of a focus on young people. And these titles, these papers that we looked at, these documents, some of them were policy documents, some of them were newspaper articles, some of them, they just came in a variety of forms. In terms of what we are looking for. They covered about 53 countries in Africa. They covered about 53 countries in Africa. And then, that's right. So I keep going. And then we also compiled chronological data on national economic responses from other sources. And one of the major sources was the Oxford COVID-19 tracker database, which helps provide a high-level picture of trends in economic relief measures over time in different places. And then using the information we could find in other places, we were able to complement that to create what we refer to as a heat map of how economic recovery policy in the context of the pandemic, was evolving. And that is the issue in the next slide. In some slide that I will come to much later. Now, in addition to that as well, we conducted primary interviews in different countries. We spoke to young people, we spoke to advocates, we spoke to entrepreneurs, we spoke to people in government. We also spoke to people in the private sector. And the purpose of this was to, see and hear from them what was happening in their countries, what they were doing, and how young people were actually, represented as a voice, as a group, as people, who are major stakeholders in the recovery process. Now, the next slide, this is it. This slide, I think there is, if you activate this slide, what you will see, and I'm not sure why that is not happening. If you activate these two slides, what you will see is how economic recovery processes were happening across across Africa. This slide there is a way you activate it, and it shows you what was happening in each African country over the time. Which country was implementing what kind of policies the country was implementing. In some countries, for instance, they were replacing less than 50% of the salaries, for workers. In other countries, it was less than 50%. There were also countries where, as if that slide plays very well, where you will see some countries, announcing that there will be a moratorium on the payment of on contracts. For instance, if you are supposed to pay light bills in your country, if you're supposed to pay water bills in your country, if you are owing the bank, for instance, that the government, has worked with those institutions to stop payment of those things until people are able to are back on their feet. So that is how that is some of the things that were happening in the different countries. And the slides also shows you which countries were not doing anything in the continent during that period. And this slide actually will show you what happened at least between March 2020 to July 2021 when the study terminated. But I'm not sure why that is not that the slide is not able to activate on this from that end. So the slide also will tell you which countries were actually implementing some direct income support, and which countries were not able to do that. There were African countries, and we have to be fair and acknowledge the truth that actually some countries were also making direct transfers to particular populations, to the elderly, to people in particular sectors like tourism and all that. Governments were actually making direct payment to in some countries to such populations, which is quite very important. So I think let's move to slide 14. So from the literature we reviewed, we found that there were the fewest policy documents focusing on recovery existed in Central Africa and in North Africa. There were lots of activities happening in Southern Africa, in Eastern Africa, and in Western Africa. But the fewest policy documents we found were from Central Africa and North Africa. It does not really mean, and we have to be cautious in terms of interpreting what this means. It does not mean that activities were not happening in those places. It could simply mean that governments were not publishing some of the things that they were doing in terms of recovery policies. We also found that the largest overall proportion of policies and programs, about 38% of them, were actually funded by national governments, which is very, very important. I think many of us sometimes do not realize that our governments might not be performing very well, but they still take on a huge burden of investments in terms of well-being, in terms of services as for the people. Now, these economic recovery packages that we found took the form of one, government-led efforts to promote, protect, and create employment, particularly for vulnerable people, including young people and women. We saw that in quite a number of countries. And then the key sectors that were targeted across the region were tourism, and that is not unexpected because these were also among the worst hit sectors by the pandemic. Tourism, agriculture, small and medium scale enterprises, and entrepreneurship. Now, government interventions took a variety of forms, like I said before. Some of them involved direct cash transfers and tax reliefs. In some countries, small-scale businesses were told not to pay taxes until a future date. That's also a major intervention in terms of economic recovery in those countries. There were also activities and interventions by multilaterals and funders of African governments. Some of them, placed a moratorium on loan repayments until a future date, and those were implemented in the hope of stabilizing the economy and ensuring that in the midst of this crisis that some form of growth and stability will exist in those countries. Moving forward, we found that there were actually very few countries, that had very clear, a clearly articulated economic recovery plan in the context of COVID. Very few countries actually had that as at the time this study stopped, which was July 2021. There were very few countries, with a clearly articulated, solid plan for economic recovery. And the countries that we found across the continent that had those plans were Eswatini, Kenya, Malawi, and South Africa. Other countries, mentioned it here and there in the policy document on air, when the president is giving a speech. But these are the countries that, have started thinking about that and formulated a strategy in terms of recovery. And in many of these, interventions and policy documents and speeches that presidents made, there was emphasis placed on youth economic empowerment and recovery opportunities. I mean, they were all there, mentioned here and there. And they took the form of, support to youth-led businesses, the creation of education, mentoring opportunities, vocational skills for young people, and all that. And there were also, plans and talks around improving youth employment, post the pandemic. But we found that I think the most clearly articulated plan when it came to actionable youth inclusion in terms of recovery from COVID was by the government of Kenya, which is something to think about. And we don't know we did not explore the reasons. We have our thoughts about that. We have our hypothesis about that, but we found that to be quite very interesting. The government, developed plans around providing free internet access to young people, mentoring young entrepreneurs, and even organize some funds that would go directly into youth empowerment organizations and businesses. I think we also wanted to we also found that other countries were, planning different things in terms of economic stimulus and investments. Many of them could have targeted young people. Many of them would have benefited young people, but they did not directly target young people in that process. Some of them went to, like, for instance, the point I made earlier about placing a moratorium on the payment of utilities. Water in the household, light in the household. Of course, those were not directly targeted at young people, of course, but they would have benefited young people in the process. So it's important to also take note of that. So let's move on to the next slide. Like I said, what I presented, what I just finished speaking to, we are based on our review of the literature, looking at different policies in different countries and all that. But we also collected primary data. And by primary data, I mean, we also spoke to government, people in government, policymakers, young people, funders, and different groups, different stakeholders, in the business of recovery in the context of the pandemic. And speaking to all these people, I mean, the general assessment and the sentiment that we found was that the pandemic had very major negative socioeconomic implications for young people. And many of these implications also had strong gender-related dimensions. We'll come to that at a different point in the presentation. The young people we spoke to across the continent, in different parts of the continent, reported limited participation and involvement in the development of recovery programs in their countries. There were actually 4 different countries where we focused a lot of attention in terms of speaking to young people. Nigeria was one, South Africa was the other, Kenya was also involved, and then Rwanda was the 4th country where we did a deep dive, working with young people, policymakers, to understand what was happening in terms of the rollout and implementation of these economic recovery processes. We found out, talking to young people, talking to governments, talking to different stakeholders in these countries, that few of these countries' recovery plans specifically targeted young people. And when they targeted young people, they took them as a group. There was very little effort to take into consideration the fact that young people might look the same in terms of age, but they have different issues. There were those in the rural areas, there were those in the urban areas, there were those who are educated, and those who have very little formal education. There were those who are in and out of school, those with youth and those without disability. They all have different steps and different and they occupy different places in the context of the pandemic. But governments across the continent did not factor those dynamics within the youth population did not consider those in terms of the responses that they implemented. A few of the young people we spoke to, reported directly benefiting from these pandemic measures, or even saying that they knew somebody who did. There were very few people who said that they benefited, or that they can point at somebody or knew somebody who did benefit from those, which is quite very interesting. In some countries that we like, in particular with South Africa, young people actually reported that NGOs and the private sector, had much better plans, better strategies, better interventions that brought a focus on young people. At least that is the experience that that is the data we found and elicited in the countries that we studied. And in some countries too, we found that young people felt that some of the governmental actions implemented during that period were actually very detrimental to the well-being and welfare and development of young people. For instance, in Nigeria, during that period, there was a ban on Twitter. And many young people said they used Twitter to do their businesses. And they were frustrated. There was very little they could do in terms of continuing to pursue their businesses. And across the different countries that we studied, there was also the feeling that governments were taking loans from different places, and that the future of these loans, the conditions of these loans, the agreements behind these loans were not known to young people. And these are things that might mortgage their future and compromise their well-being in the future. So those are some of the things that we found in terms of the primary data. And then many young people also felt that they thought that governments, we actually, fast-track investments in the digital infrastructure in different countries, but that did not happen. It was all talk here and there about how this will happen, about how internet will be expanded, and there was nothing to show for it. So those are some of the things that that emerged in summary from the work. And let me just move on here to the next slide. So in terms of an overall picture of what emerged from the work, and to conclude, we found that there was general agreement from the literature we surveyed, from the people we spoke to, from the interviews we had, that there is no way we can think about a sustainable recovery post-pandemic in Africa without thinking about young people. They are at the heart of it. They must take a center stage, but little was happening. And little was happening not just in terms of the design, but in terms of the delivery of these measures across the country. Some countries were making some implementation, making some efforts, but many of them also lack transparency and accountability, and failed to recognize the variations that we find among young people. And then I think another very important thing for us from that study was that in terms of the big agenda items, were that across the countries where we studied and did in-depth interviews, young people were actually very enthusiastic and had ideas about how to support the process of recovery post pandemic. We've made some recommendations at the end of the study, and we felt that based on some of the issues that we saw in the literature and from the interviews, that there is actually a very strong need to improve advocacy in the region, so that we are keeping youth inclusion on the agenda at all times. We didn't find very strong regional advocacy on this issue in the study that we did. I think we are also wondering whether it will actually be very useful to the continent to think about supporting, funders and other people to think about supporting watchdog organizations, who can, scale up their demand and monitoring of accountability and transparency as we move in this post-pandemic recovery period. Because governments will make all kinds of speeches, they will make all kinds of promises, but there is very little in terms of keeping them to those promises and making sure that they're delivering on the promises that they make to populations. And then we also found that talking to young policymakers, everybody has this whole idea of youth inclusion, making sure that gender is reflected in the programs that we're implementing, but very little exists in terms of capacity to actually do that. It's not just about it. It's not just a question of talking about it, but what would youth inclusion really mean? Many of the government people we spoke to do not understand what that means. Sometimes it's about gathering young people and taking their voice and then telling them we incorporate that. And that is how youth inclusion is defined across the continent. And then I said this study stopped in July 2021. We don't know what has happened since then. And I think it might be important to think about, following up to know what is happening, where change has occurred, where things have stalled, and all that, so that we're able to be able to make a very strong recommendation over a long period of time. I will end with this wonderful assertion from one of the young people, youth leaders we interviewed from South Africa. And his point was that there is no one size that fits all when it comes to addressing youth problems and issues in Africa, particularly in the context of the pandemic. And that people were doing different things. The church was doing their own thing, the mosque was doing their own thing, people in youth sports was doing their own thing, banks were doing their own thing. And that there was need for all these sectors to think of a strategy that will work, where every sector's effort is complemented by the activities of the other sector. And that is a final point that I'll end the presentation with. Apologies for the hard start and the crisis in terms of setting up the slide, but I'm here with you, and thanks everybody for listening in.
Wow, thank you. There can't be any sustainable and equitable recovery without thinking about young people. Thank you so much, Dr. Chima, for giving us a lot of things to think about. The research is quite very extensive and rigorous, and I particularly enjoyed it. And I can see that it's stimulating a lot of discussions. There'll be an open dialogue series where we are going to get a lot of questions and then begin the conversation. And I'm also very excited that you have also reiterated the importance of organizations, groups working together for the economic recovery. And at this moment, we are going to move to another section of the program. We're going to invite Emmanuel Eduji, the Executive Director of Youth Opportunity and Transformation in Africa, to give us a presentation on Africa Youth Partnership to advocate an equitable recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. And first of all, I would like to apologize for the PowerPoint situation. We're beginning to think it might be an integration issue between Microsoft and the Google platform we're using. It seems that unlike Zoom, you cannot have a full screen view of your PowerPoint projections at this point in Google Meet, which also means we will have to consider maybe Zoom or something else in the future until this is resolved. So apologies for that situation, but I think Dr. Chima's presentation lays probably the best foundation for what we're about to discuss now, and I would like to thank him for laying that foundation and also doing that with such short notice to you, Dr. Chima. I would also like to thank the Ford Foundation. Margaret is here, thank you so much, but also Dabisaki and all the teams in the Eastern, Southern, and Western Africa offices. Thank you, everyone who is on this call from around the world. This is a very brief presentation to capture the key issues that the partnership we're launching would like to address. And so we'll look at the challenge, we'll look at the mission we're setting for ourselves, and the strategy that we're hoping to iterate over the period. And so I think Farai is somewhere on the call as well. Hello, Farai from Restless Development, who's our counterpart on the project. Please chip in any contributions at any point. Just draw my attention to that. So for the challenge, I think, again, Dr. Chima's presentation really shows us the challenge, the importance of ensuring that young people play a forefront role in the whole recovery agenda. Any policy process that does not include what I believe is Africa's largest population or cohorts would be doomed to failure. And that's because this group of people, young people across Africa, have not been spared the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic. So before COVID, we all know the problems African youth faced, and COVID has simply amplified or escalated these problems and made situations worse for young people. So if you look at areas such as disrupted education, reduced access to essential goods, food insecurities, issues about violence, abuse, exploitation, the increase in spate of poverty, all of these issues, which we already knew about as issues that young people faced across the continent, have been worsened or escalated, and makes the situation of young people much worse now. And particularly when it comes to vaccines and their potential for economic achievement. A lot of people don't see it that way. Vaccines will ensure, have a potential of ensuring that young people are in good health and they are able to go about and contribute to the economic development of their countries. But I think we all know the challenges of vaccine access, vaccine uptake, vaccine distribution, all of that in the context of the existing weaknesses that African countries have in their health systems. So the challenges are definitely enormous. And the last one, I think many of you may be aware of the assertion or the views of citizens on the continent that many African governments have simply found COVID-19 as a nice way of, hiding behind a global pandemic and doing other things, and with almost no transparency or accountability. In many of our countries, there's been concerns about mismanagement of COVID funds and allocation of resources. And so that lack of transparency and accountability in a pandemic, makes it impossible for young people and other marginalized groups to be engaged in the process. And so, yes, the challenge we are faced with as a continent in general, but in particular as young people, is something that is massive. Well, so we came together, thanks to support from the Ford Foundation, to try to build on what young people have already started doing on their own. I'm sure that many of the people on this call today will agree that when COVID hit, a lot of young people already took initiatives. They were building, they were creating masks, they were building hand washing systems, they were volunteering. Lots of young people did many things by themselves, taking the lead in the COVID recovery, even without anyone telling them. So that's initiative. But to make that a systemic thing so we can have a much larger scale impact, we need to improve the capacities and skills of these young people so that they can do what they're doing much better. But in particular, so that they can hold policymakers accountable. So that capacity issue is number one. Number two is to try and enable and better connect young people so that they can build the evidence base they need for advocacy. I think this whole project is about advocating for a pro-youth recovery, so that no recovery on the continent should rather make young people worse off than they were before. And also, of course, to improve youth-led organizations as well in that process. Now, one thing we also want to do is to support young people to produce a number of reviews. And so if you remember Dr. Chima's presentation, he mentioned a number of national efforts already underway. Now, it's important that young people can gather the capacity to review that effort, to keep an eye on it, to play that watchdog role, so that government commitments are achieved but not skewed along the way, and so on. So ultimately, it's to amplify the voices of youth in policy spaces, so that in places like the African Union, in places like the United Nations, but also in national government platforms, these young people can have the capacity and audacity to speak across these platforms and let their voices be heard. So in summary, this is the kind of mission we're setting for ourselves. But the question is, how do we do that? How do we get about amplifying youth voices, building capacity for young people's mobilization, and also ensuring a coherent and united effort? Well, I mean, that process is going to be an iterative one, because just like the pandemic is evolving, our strategy would also have no option but to evolve along the way. I think we all know that, we're currently in a more easier situation globally compared to even 6 months ago with Omicron and so on. And so as the pandemic evolves, so will our strategy. So the following activities will not be cut in stone. They will be open to changes, and we're still really developing that strategy. But to start with, this is an Africa-wide project. We aim that the project will cover young people across every country. But thanks to the Ford Foundation, we're able to support young people in the following specific countries to undertake these accountability frameworks and accountability activities. So Ghana, Gambia, Liberia, Nigeria, Kenya, Sierra Leone, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. So in each of these countries, we're building national youth tax teams to lead the national effort. So you can picture 10 of these youth tax teams in 10 African countries at the minimum. And they will be working from now till the end of the year as a pilot in various areas, including research, including accountability systems, including engaging stakeholders, and then, of course, ultimately achieving results for youth. We're also supporting teams of youth to deploy innovation. So as I mentioned, a lot of young people have already done so many innovative things to help their nations or their countries in the recovery effort. We simply want to be able to escalate that to a higher level. By the end of 2020, our hope is to do a minimum of 100 top-end innovation programs spearheaded by young people, but supported by a network of coaches and mentors, and also in some cases financial support to carry out some of the best of these innovative ideas. And of course, we're establishing what we call the Africa Youth Panel. This will be drawn from the national tax teams. So imagine various national youth tax teams, and then a smaller regional Africa continental panel drawn from that. So imagine maybe one from each country. Their role will be to spearhead the regional and global effort to ensure that on those platforms such as the African Union, on those platforms such as the high-level political forum in the United Nations, on those forums such as the UNICEF Generation Unlimited, and all of those global destinations for ensuring effective youth participation, we're going to make sure, and thanks to funding from Ford, we are able to support these young people to travel there either in person or virtually to be able to navigate the corridors of power. And we're facilitating the African Youth Panel's participation in those convenings and processes with the sole purpose of amplifying youth voices. So imagine a chain where the national youth tax teams are collecting and collating youth voices about the most important issues of their recovery in their nations. That is escalated to a regional youth panel that packages that and then presents to a global or several global platforms, such as the World Bank, the UN, the African Union, and all of that. And so it means that the work is ground up. It's not top down, it's ground up, and ensures that everyone's voice will be heard. And so that's really what we've set out for ourselves to do in the few months left for 2022. And depending on the success and many other factors, we can then see if this is possible to continue in the new year that comes. But in a summary, I don't know if that was a short summary, but in a summary, this is what we've set out to do. The screen you see now is the initial partners that are involved in the project. So we have the Ford Foundation providing the financial and a lot of technical support. We also then have the implementing partners, Restless Development, and then of course YOTA. So really that's it. Just to say that I believe by the end of this week, we will have the africayouthpanel.org website up and running. It's currently in a testing phase. So if you go to that page, Africa Youth Partnership, Africa Youth Partnership, thank you. Africa Youth Partnership, you will please bookmark it. As soon as the testing is over, it would be live. My colleagues are just prompting me that it should be within a day or two. This will be fully live after testing. Thank you very much, everyone. And if there are any questions, I believe we can try to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for this very detailed and extensive presentation. This has actually laid the implementation framework for the implementation of this important and very fit for purpose project. And I see a lot of alignments of this project goals with Dr. Chima's research presentation recommendation. It's quite important. And to very much few comments on Emmanuel's presentation, he has quite reiterated the importance of building capacity, ensuring integrated and coordinated youth efforts in the region, and also ensuring that safe spaces are created for young people's inclusion in building back better from COVID-19, whilst advancing the full implementation of 2030 agenda. Thank you very much. I've begun seeing some questions coming in. I know this conversation has stimulated a lot of discussions, and we'll be seeing a lot of questions coming in. We're going to move straight into the open dialogue and pick up some few questions. If you have any question, do kindly click on the raise hand button. Then I can then give you the administrators, the technicians will give you right to speak. In the meantime, there are some few questions to ask our panelists, and this would involve Dr. Chima and Emmanuel also, and some also will get to Margaret. And so we'll be very glad if you provide some feedback on the questions. The first one is the focus on a coordinated effort building synergy across the continent, young people. How can young people create spaces that are constantly shrinking to ensure economic recovery post-COVID-19? Any of you, Dr. Chima, do you want to go first, or Margaret?
Well, thanks again, Alfred. If I understand the question very well, it's we are here interested in strategies to mobilize sustainable youth engagement across the continent. If I understand that very well, I think there are quite a number of studies around movement building that we can learn from. to be able to respond on a continental scale to the problem of lack of coordination in terms of different strands of youth engagement and political issues. So maybe that's the literature we need to look at to be able to answer that question. But I also know that for a long time, the Ford Foundation has also been in the forefront of trying to build synergies, and then maybe there is some information from Margaret that we can glean from that. But one of the points, the big thing I want to just say to that is that young people across the continent might be in different places. They might have different lived experiences, but they're almost dealing with the same thing. So it is quite easy to mobilize them. They are dealing with poor governance across their different countries. Poor quality education, lack of access to health. And those things are similar, in different levels. So the potential for mobilization across the continent is there. But I need to agree that I have not studied that. I like to speak from research experience. I've not studied it, but I think the groundwork, the resources, the context to make that happen is there. And maybe those who have experience in terms of that mobilization can contribute to more specifically in terms of strategies to make that happen.
Okay, thank you, Chima. I can go on, Alfred, and give a few reflections on this. So when we are looking at young people in Africa, maybe I'm sorry to say this, but of late I'm just getting agitated, because when you have the numbers, what can stop you from accessing these spaces that you need to get them? But again, we also must understand, even when I use that term that I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable, that young people are different. We cannot just say it's a homogeneous group. And I think for me, the greatest challenge we have is the mobilization of this different or diversified group of young people. Communities, we have those who are living in urban. We have thinking about building youth movement, what Chima has just mentioned. The greatest challenge is, how do you bring all these groups of young people together? That is one. Two, how do you stop being elitist? Because I see many youth-led organizations, once they start getting funding, specifically those who are living in, they have offices in major cities. Sometimes they are overtaken by events. And I think most of it is donor-driven or donor-inflicted, in the sense that instead of remaining or putting our feet on the ground as youth-led organizations, what you do, you allow donors like the Ford Foundation to push you to create programs from their own understanding. And then finally, I also want to say that change is not linear. And I think there is need for patience, specifically when young people are seeking to access these spaces that are shrinking. And you have to continually thinking, innovatively, creatively, thinking of new methods of getting into these spaces. And I just want to also say, the majority of the people who vote are young people, specifically in many places in Africa. You clearly have seen the track records of the leaders that are seeking for elections. Why are we voting them in? Yeah? And why aren't we? I know you tell me campaigns and all that are very expensive and all that. But I'm encouraged anyway. We are just going to have our 2022 elections in Kenya. I've seen 22, 24, 23-year-old girls winning the preliminaries within their parties. And I think for me that is encouraging. And unless we have people focusing on the political pillar to change the policies to favor the young people, the economic aspect of the young people, then it will be a bit difficult for us to make that shift as fast as we can. I think those are just my reflections on this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Margaret. The key takeaway, do not underestimate youth power. It is a good force for equitable recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. We're going to, we've seen Farai's hand up. Farai is the Director for Restless Development in Zimbabwe. So we invite him. Farai, let's hear you. We just lost Farai, unfortunately. So we'll take.
Hi, Alfred. Hello, Alfred.
Yeah, yes. Good.
Great, thank you. It's good to hear, Margaret speaking, coming from a donor perspective, because my contribution was going to be around the fact that we also, calling on donors, to really understand, the issue of meaningful youth engagement, and also listening, from us as, the youth civil, coming from the youth civil society, and hearing us and giving us platforms to be able to give them what sort of projects would like to run, and then see how they link with with their own agenda, because I think as she rightfully says, there is need to have a push to ensure that as organizations we are not driven by what donors require. But I think also in the same vein, we would also like, to call upon donors, to really understand that phenomenon, that, there is need for donors to also listen and hear what are the issues, and then how those issues fit into their donor priorities, and then, have a more bottom-up approach as opposed to top-bottom approach, where there is, real listening and real meaningful youth engagement in terms of addressing the issues that young people are facing. I think we've seen a lot of organizations and a lot of donors trying to engage with young people, but I think the challenge is to what level and to what degree are donors taking some of the issues that are being raised, and how are they also willing to to change, and to change the way they've been doing things before, and really be meaningful in addressing these issues, because otherwise we will continue having these meetings where spaces are provided for young people to participate and have their voices heard, but it all ends up in in voices being heard, but with very little tangible outcomes that are that are coming out of it and being addressed by both youth civil society as well as donor organizations. So in addition to everything, it's also a call to ensuring that donors are also responsive, and also understand the fact that they need probably maybe to set aside their goals for a moment, listen, and then actually have their goals set by what issues are actually coming out from the grassroots. Thank you, Alfred.
Yeah, thank you very much, Farai, for also giving us a lot of perception about this whole conversation, all-important conversation that we have in. I will leave the floor open. We have an open dialogue now, and if you want to contribute to this discussion or have any question, would be glad to take them up. Just raise your hand, click on the raise hand button, and I'll call you. As well, you can also use the submitting the questions in call messages. At the in-call messages, you can submit your questions there as well, and I'll read them out. Or any of our social media platforms that's streaming this, we are picking up questions from there as well. Yes, Vincent, yes. Please introduce yourself and then you can speak.
Hello.
Thank you.
Hello.
I can
Hello.
hear you.
Yeah, please. My name is Vincent. Yeah, actually, my problem is that the whole issue is about youth inclusion in almost every sector in Africa, ranging from education, economic, political, and all social. But we have talked about a lot. But my problem is that after equipping the youth to understand themselves and to take responsibility now as future leaders, how do we then amplify our voices for our voices to be heard? And more importantly, after our voices are being heard, how is the outcome going to be? Our desires or what we expect from our end, how is it going to be considered in the country or Africa as a whole?
Thank you very much, Vincent. This question is for Farai, for Emmanuel, for Dr. Chima, and Margaret as well. So how can we enable young voices? So who would go first? Maybe Dr. Chima, if you can go first.
Okay, I mean, thanks, Vincent, for that thought-provoking question. I think we are here today talking because we are using evidence to provoke and, I don't want to use the word instigate because that might sound very revolutionary, but to provoke young people to see that the opportunities are there and there's room for change. So that is just one way that's this arming people with evidence is very, very important for me in that process. And that is what I can say that we are doing today. But you speak to a much larger question, which is even when young people are, provoked and instigated and armed with the evidence to engage, there is still a lot of hurdles ahead of things, of that process. This is not the right forum to engage with all of that hurdle. I mean, young people have been making efforts. Some of us today who are maybe in a different age category, we are also young people who were involved in the struggle. But the problems that we dealt with then are also the issues that young people are dealing with currently. So it is something that maybe it's a different way of engagement, a different way of supporting young people to engage and find a voice that we should actually be speaking to. I will pause there and then allow others to engage.
Thank you.
Alfred, I can come in. I think the issue of amplifying voices, the voices are already there. And I think a lot of work is happening at the grassroots level, and it's being led by young people, and to some extent at the national level. But I think the gap that exists is how do these voices move to the regional and global level? Because the voices must be heard, and it's not just hearing the voices. Because if young people are not careful, again, you can be there ticking the box that there were young people included in this conversation. But I think even as YOTA, Restless Development, and other youth-serving organizations, which are represented in this forum, I think you need to really think about the disconnection between the grassroots voices, national voices, regional, and global voices. And I'm really glad that we're having this forum because this is creating another another space for regional conversations. And I hope that this is going to start, some interest in many young people to start also putting, or rather pushing their voices at these levels. And not just pushing voices which also come along with the calls for action.
Thank you very much, Margaret. I think this project is an enabler of youth voices to advocate for equitable recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. So we have some ways to start from, and this conversation will keep on going. Is there anyone who wants to throw their voice in there? It's an ongoing conversation. We'll continue to have this conversation even after this event, as Margaret has already reiterated. It's important that we continue this conversation, even at the regional level. Emmanuel, would you want to throw your voice in to add maybe a concluding remarks on this open dialogue section, since we don't have any more questions coming in?
No, I mean, thank you for the opportunity. I can speak the whole day about youth participation in Africa, so I didn't want to be tempted. The issue is that, so for many years, Africa, either because of our culture, where young people can be seen but not heard, so seen in terms of being part of political violence or conflict or whatever, but not being heard in terms of their needs and aspirations and hopes and all of that. We've made lots of progress in the last 20 years, ensuring that young people can now both speak and to a very large extent be heard. The question, and I think that first question from the questioner was really good, because a lot of governments, a lot of even donors, but also state institutions are still finding it very difficult to understand what is the best way to ensure that youth participation is achieved. And so we are at that point where a lot of examples, a lot of success stories need to be shared and advocated. And so that's why this project, at a very regional level, is trying to show the way on this current global issue that we're faced with, the global public health pandemic that we have at hand, to try and model or showcase what it is that youth participation can do, not only so that we can make the case for it, but also so that young people's real issues about health, issues about economic empowerment and opportunity, issues about education and so on, can also be integrated in the process. Otherwise, we run the risk of leaving out young people in that recovery agenda. And I think, as you know, the most important mantra in our Sustainable Development Goals to the year 2030 is leave no one behind. And I would say leave no youth behind. And so for me, let me end it there so that we can continue the conversations.
Thank you, Emmanuel, for reiterating this very important thing of not leaving any youth behind. It's also important to remind ourselves that there's a side event that is launching the Africa Youth Partnership for Equitable Recovery from COVID-19 pandemic. Next on our agenda is to move straight to the project launch and call to action. We have some very important young African leaders coming from Tanzania, Rwanda, Ghana, and Gabon. They are going to have a short presentation. The first person we're going to invite will be Gloria Anderson from Tanzania. Gloria.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alfred. My internet is not that stable, so I would prefer not putting on a video. But is it okay if I share my screen?
It is okay. Please go ahead.
Oh. Well,
right.
greetings. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you so much, Alfred. Thank you so much, the presenters and everybody who contributed in the dialogue. It was very fruitful and productive conversations. My name is Gloria Anderson. I am the founder and the executive director of Tanzania Enlightenment Development Innovation, an NGO that works to improve the quality of education by basically integrating innovative ways of learning. Basically, after COVID-19, I'm pioneering digital learning and digital teaching skills by having a project called One Computer Lab, One School in Tanzania, whereby we are mobilizing resources to establish computer labs so as to stimulate technology in learning and teaching. So basically, I'll just go right quickly into presenting my statement as a call to action towards digital revolution and curriculum changes in Africa education system. Well, education systems in Africa have not been spared the ravage of the COVID-19 pandemic. With very little warning, the whole approach to education through classroom teaching became unviable, with little plan to replace it. As we launched the Africa Youth Partnership, one, we call on African governments working with international and private sector partners to take the lead in developing the infrastructure of 21st century education for all. They should see the experience of COVID-19 as an opportunity to stimulate technology-assisted learning across the education sectors. Second, we also call on governments, local authorities, and education institutions in Africa to urgently build an appropriate distance and technology-enabled component into the curriculum, integrating a blended, self-paced element into all learning without disadvantaging any child. African governments should also prioritize the training of teachers in the use of technology and in conducting lessons online. And thirdly, we further call on governments in Africa to develop, through physical measures and other incentives, an enabling environment and to encourage the private sector to contribute to a firm technological basis for education systems. So these are my call to actions towards improving the digital revolutions and curriculum changes in Africa education systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gloria. We'll have the presentation in this order. So Grace Neza from Rwanda, Vera Ado from Ghana, and then we have Tamara Bosamba from the Gabon. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I'm on the move. My internet is not that stable, so I won't be able to turn on my camera if that is okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alfred, and thank you everyone for attending. And I really want to thank the presenters because this is it's an exciting opportunity. And for me, it's my very first time to attend this kind of event, and I think it's really important. So my name is Ineza. I am an ecofeminist, impact-driven actor in the climate change sector based in Rwanda. I am a founder and executive director of a Rwandan NGO called the Green Protector, where we aim to increase an active youth participation in the protection of the environment on both the national and international level. So my call to action is linked to the climate change negative impact in terms of COVID-19. Apologies, I don't have any slides, so I'll rather be speaking. I will try to speak as clear as possible. The climate change negative impact did not take a pause with the global pandemic. However, they added more challenge, especially for the frontline community who are mainly located in Africa. Our ability to protect our future and achieve the Paris Agreement depend on our effort to address the losses and damages as well as how we adapt to and mitigate climate change, we are all actors to reduce and minimize and stop the planetary crisis that we are driving fast rate into. Our call to action included in the Africa Youth Partnership. First, we need to strengthen the climate resilient community in Africa to address the food security. Climate change impact affects smallholders farmers, which more than a majority are women. We need climate smart agriculture that are gender sensitive. And we also need to address the losses and damages resulting from the climate change impact. Second, we need water security is threatened by the climate change. Every drop count. We call for an increased access to water and sanitation by optimizing water management for an effective distribution within the community across Africa. Third, unemployment rates need to be reduced. We call for sustainable job opportunity for youth to reduce and stamp out poverty in Africa. We call for resilient infrastructure, both economic, educational, public, business across every sector, to be a source for a sustainable economic growth of the continent within and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic recovery. Coming from Rwanda, a country that youth inclusion is not tokenistic, we can all be part of the solution. I thank you everyone for your attention. Thanks.
Thank you. Excellent. All right, so that was Grace Inesa from Rwanda. Thank you. And the next is Verado from Ghana. Vera.
Thank you, Alfred. My name is Vera Ado from Ghana, and I'm speaking on girls' education during the COVID-19 pandemic. We know that when it comes to the effects of the disruption to education systems caused by the COVID-19 pandemic, girls have been hardest hit. They are the least likely to return to school and are also most vulnerable to dropping out. Worst of all, they face increased rates of early marriage and adolescent pregnancy during times of disruption in their education. In Ghana, the Ministry of Health reported 1,009,865 teenage pregnancies in 2020 alone. A study also done by Africa Education Watch recorded that 1 to 3 girls not returning to school due to teenage pregnancy. And so as we launch the African Youth Partnership, 1, we call on governments and development partners in Africa to ensure continual learning through distance education during times of disruption, to continually engage and educate all girls and ease their return upon reopening of schools. 2, we call on governments, African governments specifically, to create an enabling environment for inclusive education by eliminating policies and practices that expel pregnant girls and establishing continuation policies and strategies to facilitate the continuing education of pregnant girls and adolescent mothers. 3, we also call on governments and development partners in Africa to deliver gender transformative teacher training and education, to create discrimination-free classroom environments, including sexual and reproductive health education, to help reduce teenage pregnancy, and to facilitate accelerated learning program for adolescent mothers returning to school. We further call on governments and development partners to fully finance education, to protect education budget from potential cuts, and to facilitate supportive measures for pregnant girls and adolescent mothers to continue their education and recover education systems from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much, Alfred. These are my call to action on education and young girls across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera from Ghana. Now we invite Tamara Osamba from Gabon. You're muted.
Okay, I think it's okay. Okay, so now it's okay. Thank you so much. My name is Tamara. I am from Gabon. So I'm an economist and entrepreneur in agriculture. I will be speaking about youth and women-led SMEs during the COVID-19 pandemic. So During the COVID-19 pandemic, youth and women-led SMEs have faced steep challenges in coping compared to larger firms. They have struggled to stay alive with their operations, hampered by a sharp fall in sales and revenues, the inability to access adequate financial relief, and often the inability to transition to remote work. So as we launch the Africa Youth Partnership, we call on government and development partners in Africa to accelerate technology adoption, innovation, and digital skills training for youth and women entrepreneurs. This includes the design of an African strategy that accelerate and support the digital inclusion on youth and women entrepreneurs and empowers them to be successful in both digital business and the digital economy. 2, we call on governments and development partners in Africa to improve the business climate and lower barriers to obtaining and controlling resources by strengthening financing and fiscal assistance, reaching youth and women entrepreneurs first. This includes reductions in the tax burden and social security payments for youth and women-led businesses. 3, we call on government and development partners to enable gender neutrality in sectoral, industry, and market behaviors through interventions that address pre-existing market behaviors, constraining women-led enterprises. This includes supporting young women entrepreneurs to cross over into male-dominated sectors and industries to boost women entrepreneurs' performance and decrease the gender profit gap. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Tamara. Thank you for presenting the call to action. So youth power. When I say youth power, say youth power. Youth power.
Youth
power.
Youth power.
Youth power.
Youth power.
Youth power. Have to estimate our power. This course will launch the Africa Youth Partnership Advocacy Recovery from the global COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. So I thank you all for participating. I thank the speakers, the representatives from Ford Foundation, ICRW, Restless Development and YOTA for this amazing event. And I also want to announce that we would have the call for action published on the website, as you have already heard, www.africayouthpartnership.org. And we'll be having the call to action published on the website. So you check out africayouthpartnership.org. And we also announcing that the event has been recorded and will be available on the website of ECOSOC Youth Forum for those who couldn't join. Thank you very much for joining. Give a hand of applause to all of you for joining in for this important conversation. As the speakers have already said, this is a continuous conversation, so we need to continue talking about this, how to enable new voices for equitable recovery after COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you. And there is a comment. I'm going to read the comments briefly. This from Princess Lovia Tete. She says, very insightful presentation to harness youth voices and promotes productive synergies, especially with the diversification aspects, and donor agencies, development partners, and government must put up programs, initiatives, and innovations that represent the voices of the youth and activities that are owned by the youth, especially at the grassroots level. We need to harness our voices at the local, national, and international fronts so no one is left behind. Thank you very much, Princess, for this comment. And we thank you all for attending. I wish you the very best. Let's keep youth power going. Youth power.
Youth power.
Thank you. Have a good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Bye-bye.